November 27, 1910, a Sunday morning in Manhattan. Snow dusts the streets as crowds gather on 7th Avenue, craning their necks to see something America has never witnessed before. Not a train station, a temple, 8 acres of pink granite and Roman ambition spread across 2 city blocks of the most valuable real estate on earth. 84 Doric columns rise like a forest of stone. A waiting room stretches 300 feet long and soars 150 feet toward a coffered ceiling that dwarfs the nave of St. Peter's in Rome. 30,000 light bulbs burn like captured starlight, illuminating travertine floors polished to mirror brightness. 100,000 people pour through its doors on this single day. They step inside, they look up, they stop breathing for just a moment. For the first time in their lives, they feel what it means to arrive somewhere that matters. They feel like gods entering a city worthy of gods. Beautiful, magnificent, built to outlast empires. But that is only the surface. Behind this facade of eternal stone lies a story of impossible dreams, broken bodies, corporate betrayal, and one of the greatest acts of destruction America has ever committed against itself. In just 53 years, every column will be toppled, every statue smashed, every piece of this Roman dream loaded onto trucks and dumped into the swamps of New Jersey. And New York City, the city that built it, will stand by and watch it happen. How did a palace built by the largest corporation in the world become a symbol of America's greatest architectural shame? What drove one man to risk everything, his fortune, his health, his very life, to bring trains into Manhattan when every engineer told him it was impossible? Why did he keep building even as workers died in the tunnels beneath the Hudson River? What was the price he paid, and did he know he was paying it? Why did architects who despised the building's classical style rush to save it, while the New Yorkers who loved it stood silent and let the wrecking ball swing? Why did the railroad that spent $50 million to build this monument sell it for a fraction of that to men who saw nothing but profit in its bones? And the real question, the one nobody wants to answer, the one that still haunts every city planner and preservationist and ordinary citizen who walks through the grim corridors of what replaced it. What does it say about a civilization that destroys its own monuments? Not through war, not through natural disaster, not through the slow erosion of centuries, but through choice, through a vote, through a signature on a contract. This is the story of Penn Station. If you love stories about the buildings we have lost and the history we have forgotten, please like and subscribe and tell me in the comments, what vanished landmark do you wish you could have seen? What demolished treasure haunts you? Your support makes these deep dives into America's architectural past possible, and I read every single comment. Chapter 1. The Humiliation at the Hudson. Picture it. 1900. You have traveled 500 miles from Pittsburgh on the finest railroad in America. You have paid good money for a private compartment. You have dined in a mahogany-paneled car while farmland rolled past your window. Your destination is Manhattan, the beating heart of American commerce, the city where fortunes are made and empires are built. And your train stops in Jersey City, New Jersey. You step off onto a platform crowded with stevedores hauling cargo. Livestock bellow from nearby freight cars. Porters shout over one another in half a dozen languages. You drag your trunk through the chaos to a wooden pier where a ferry bobs in the gray chop of the Hudson River. You board. You stand on the open deck in whatever weather God has chosen for that day. Rain or snow or blistering summer heat, and you watch Manhattan rise before you, so close you can almost touch the spires, yet separated from you by this miserable stretch of water. 20 minutes later, you stumble onto a Manhattan dock, your clothes damp, your dignity in tatters. You have not arrived as a conquering businessman or a visiting dignitary. You have arrived as a refugee from your own journey. This was the humiliation that passengers of the Pennsylvania Railroad endured every single day. And it was not just the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Erie Railroad terminated in Weehawken. The Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western ended in Hoboken. The Central Railroad of New Jersey deposited its passengers in Communipaw. Every one of these great railroads that had conquered mountains and bridged rivers and stretched iron rails across the vast American continent came to a pathetic halt at the western bank of the Hudson. Passengers bound for New York City had to complete their journeys by ferry or by the cramped underground Hudson tubes. Meanwhile, across town, the rival New York Central Railroad enjoyed a very different arrangement. Their trains rolled directly into the heart of Manhattan, into the original Grand Central Depot, where passengers stepped off onto solid ground in the center of the most important city in America. The Pennsylvania Railroad called itself the Standard Railroad of the world. It was the largest corporation on the planet, employing over 200,000 workers, moving more freight and passengers than any other railroad in existence. And yet it could not deliver its customers to New York City. This was more than an inconvenience. It was an embarrassment. It was a competitive disadvantage that cost the railroad millions of dollars every year. And it was a problem that one man became obsessed with solving. Chapter 2. The Rise and Exile of Alexander Cassatt, Alexander Johnston. Cassatt was born on December 8, 1839, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the son of a wealthy banker. His younger sister Mary would grow up to become one of the most celebrated Impressionist painters in history, her works hanging today in the finest museums in the world. But Alexander had no interest in art. He was drawn to machines, to mathematics, to the elegant logic of engineering. In 1856, at the age of 16, he enrolled at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute to study civil engineering. His senior thesis was entitled Review of Pressure Turbine. He graduated, and in 1861, he took a job with the Pennsylvania Railroad as a rodman in the engineering corps, the lowest rung on the ladder, surveying track alignments in the Pennsylvania wilderness. He was 21 years old. Over the next 2 decades, Cassatt rose through the ranks with extraordinary speed. He demonstrated a gift not only for engineering, but for management, for seeing the larger picture, for understanding how the thousands of moving pieces of a giant railroad fit together. By 1877, he was a vice president. By 1880, he was first vice president, the second most powerful position in the company, the heir apparent to the presidency. And then something went wrong. The details remain murky even today, but what is known is that Cassatt was passed over for the top job. Disappointed and perhaps embittered, he resigned from the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1882 at the age of 42. For 17 years, Alexander Cassatt lived the life of a country gentleman. He retreated to Chesterbrook Farm, his 600-acre estate outside Berwyn, Pennsylvania, where he bred thoroughbred racehorses and rode to hounds with the local fox hunting club. He had everything a man could want: wealth beyond measure, a loving family, rolling green pastures where champion horses grazed. He could have lived out his remaining years in comfortable obscurity, a footnote in railroad history, a man who almost ran the largest corporation in the world. But Alexander Cassatt was not built for retirement. He was haunted by unfinished business. And in 1899, after 17 years in the wilderness, the Pennsylvania Railroad came calling once more. The company was drifting. Competition was fierce. The problem of the Hudson River remained unsolved. The board of directors turned to the man they had once rejected and offered him the presidency. Cassatt accepted. He was 59 years old. Chapter 3. The Impossible Dream. What the board did not fully understand was that they had just handed the keys to the kingdom to a man with a vision so audacious it would have terrified them if they had known its full scope. Cassatt did not want merely to improve the Pennsylvania Railroad's operations. He did not want simply to increase profits or streamline schedules. He wanted to do something that every engineer who had studied the problem had declared impossible. He wanted to bring the Pennsylvania Railroad into Manhattan. The obstacle was not merely the Hudson River, though that alone was formidable. A mile of deep water with powerful tidal currents and a muddy bottom that had swallowed previous engineering attempts. The real obstacle was technology. Trains in 1900 ran on steam. Steam locomotives belched smoke and soot and poisonous gases. You could not run a steam locomotive through an underwater tunnel without suffocating every passenger on board. And even if you could, New York State was moving toward banning steam locomotives from Manhattan entirely, a law that would take effect in 1908. The mathematics seemed clear. Trains required steam. Tunnels required no steam. Therefore, trains could not use tunnels. Therefore, trains could not reach Manhattan. Cassatt refused to accept this conclusion. He had been watching developments in electric traction, the new technology of electric-powered locomotives that produced no smoke, no soot, no deadly gases. Electric trains could run through tunnels. Electric trains could run underground. Electric trains could cross beneath the Hudson River and emerge in the heart of Manhattan. The technology was still young, still unproven at the scale Cassatt envisioned. But he believed it would work. He believed it because he needed it to work. Cassatt considered several options for his Manhattan invasion. One plan called for a massive bridge across the Hudson between 45th and 50th Streets, a structure that would have dwarfed the Brooklyn Bridge and transformed the Manhattan skyline. The bridge would have been spectacular. It would also have been spectacularly expensive and would have required years of political battles over air rights and approaches. Cassatt studied the plans and made his decision. Not a bridge, a tunnel. 2 tunnels, actually, one for each direction, bored through the silt beneath the Hudson River. The tunnel option would cost 1/3 as much as the bridge. It would be faster to build. And at the Manhattan end of those tunnels, Cassatt would build something the world had never seen. A train station so magnificent it would make every passenger who passed through its doors feel that they had arrived at the center of the universe. Chapter 4. The Architects of Grandeur. Cassatt needed architects who could match the scale of his ambition. He chose the most prestigious firm in America. McKim, Mead, and White had designed some of the most celebrated buildings of the Gilded Age: the Boston Public Library, the Rhode Island State House, the campus of Columbia University. According to the architectural historian Robert A. M. Stern, only Frank Lloyd Wright was more important to the identity and character of modern American architecture than this single firm. The 3 founding partners represented different facets of architectural genius. William Rutherford Mead was the pragmatist, the businessman, the one who kept projects on budget and on schedule. Stanford White was the flamboyant showman, and famous for his lavish parties and his complicated romantic entanglements as much as for his buildings. And Charles Follen McKim was the scholar, the intellectual, the partner most deeply devoted to the classical tradition that stretched back through the Renaissance to ancient Rome. It was McKim who took the lead on the Pennsylvania Station project. Cassatt had told him that he wanted a station inspired by the Gare d'Orsay in Paris, the magnificent Beaux-Arts terminal that had dazzled visitors to the 1900 World Exposition. McKim traveled to Europe to study the great train stations of the continent, but when he returned, his mind was filled not with Paris, but with Rome. He had visited the ruins of the Baths of Caracalla, the enormous public bathing complex built by the Emperor Caracalla in the 3rd century. Standing among those ancient vaults and columns, McKim had seen something that no other architect had seen. He had seen Penn Station. The design that McKim created was an enlarged adaptation of the Baths of Caracalla, translated into pink granite and steel. The main waiting room would echo the tepidarium of the ancient baths, a vast hall covered by a coffered ceiling that seemed to float impossibly overhead. Massive Doric columns would line the facades, their proportions calculated according to principles that Roman architects had perfected 2,000 years before. The building would stretch across 4 city blocks of Manhattan, from 31st to 33rd Street and from 7th to 8th Avenue. It would be the largest indoor space in New York City. It would be a temple to transportation, a monument to American ambition, a declaration that the Pennsylvania Railroad was not merely a business, but a civilization. McKim threw himself into the project with an intensity that worried his partners. His health had never been robust, and the strain of designing the most important building of his career began to take its toll. But there was another shadow hanging over the firm during these years. Stanford White, the most colorful of the 3 partners, had been carrying on affairs with various women for years, most notoriously with a young actress and model named Evelyn Nesbit. White had pursued Nesbit when she was only 16 years old. She later married Harry Kendall Thaw, an unstable millionaire who became consumed with jealousy over his wife's past relationship with the architect. On the evening of June 25, 1906, Thaw approached White at the rooftop theater of Madison Square Garden, a building that White himself had designed, drew a pistol, and shot him 3 times in the face. Stanford White died instantly in the building he had created. The murder became the scandal of the century, splashed across newspaper front pages for months. And there is a dark irony in the location. Madison Square Garden, the arena where Stanford White was killed, would eventually be demolished, and its replacement, the new Madison Square Garden, would be built directly on top of Penn Station, the masterpiece that White's firm was designing at the moment of his death. Chapter 5. Blood Beneath the Rivers. Imagine standing at the edge of the East River in 1906. The waterfront stretches before you, are crowded with piers and warehouses and the ceaseless traffic of a city that never rests. But beneath your feet, something extraordinary is happening. 75 feet below the surface, in pressurized iron tubes, barely wide enough for men to stand upright, workers are clawing through the muck and rock beneath the riverbed. The air down there is thick and foul, compressed to pressures that make ears bleed and joints ache. The light comes from flickering lamps that cast strange shadows on the dripping walls. The men work in shifts, rotating in and out of the pressurized chambers through airlocks designed to prevent the tunnels from flooding. They are called sand hogs, these tunnel workers, and they are dying. The killer was invisible and poorly understood. They called it the bends, or caisson disease, what we now know as decompression sickness. When workers spent hours in the high-pressure environment of the tunnels and then returned too quickly to normal pressure, nitrogen bubbles formed in their blood and tissues. The bubbles lodged in joints, causing agonizing pain. They blocked blood vessels in the spine, causing paralysis. They traveled to the brain, causing death. The Pennsylvania Railroad hired doctors and built treatment facilities, but the science of decompression was still in its infancy. Men kept dying, and the men who did not die from the bends faced other dangers: cave-ins, explosions, equipment failures. In one terrible accident, a blowout sent a 40-foot geyser of muck erupting from the East River, the compressed air in the tunnel finding a weak spot in the riverbed and punching through to the surface. More than a dozen workers would be killed before the tunnels were completed. Their names are largely forgotten now, swallowed by history like so many laborers who built the monuments that outlived them. But the tunnels advanced. Day by day, foot by foot, the iron tubes pushed forward beneath the Hudson River on the west and the East River on the east. The engineering was unprecedented in its precision. When workers finally connected the two ends of the first Hudson River tunnel after 2 years of digging through silt and rock in opposite directions, the alignment was off by 1/16 of an inch. 1/16 of an inch after boring through thousands of feet of riverbed. It was a triumph of mathematics and human determination, achieved at a cost measured in broken bodies and shortened lives. At above ground, the scale of construction was equally staggering. Over 3 million cubic yards of earth had to be excavated from the Manhattan building site, a hole stretching across 4 city blocks that swallowed entire streets and required the demolition of hundreds of buildings. The total cost of the project, including the station and all associated tunnels, reached $114 million, equivalent to nearly $3 billion today. It was the most expensive construction project in American history to that point, funded entirely by the Pennsylvania Railroad without a penny of government money. Chapter 6: The Price of Vision. Alexander Cassatt drove the project forward with relentless energy. He negotiated with politicians. He battled with contractors. He reviewed engineering reports and architectural drawings and financial statements. He fought off challenges from rival railroads and skeptical bankers and his own board of directors when they grew nervous about the mounting costs. The stress was immense, the hours brutal, the pressure unrelenting. Cassatt was no longer a young man. He was in his late 60s now, and the strain was carving years off his life. His family watched with growing alarm as his health deteriorated. His doctors urged him to slow down, to delegate, to remember that he had already achieved more than most men could dream of. Cassatt ignored them all. He had waited 17 years for this chance. He had spent his retirement haunted by the vision of trains rolling into Manhattan. He would see it through or die trying. He died trying. On December 28, 1906, Alexander Johnston Cassatt suffered heart failure at his home on Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia. He was 67 years old. The tunnels beneath the Hudson were still being dug. The great station above them existed only in blueprints and architectural models. Cassatt had given everything to bring trains into Manhattan: his fortune, his health, his peace of mind, his life. And he died more than 3 years before a single passenger would ever walk through the doors of the monument he had willed into existence. The Pennsylvania Railroad mourned its fallen president and then did what great corporations do. It moved forward. James McCrea took over as president. The tunnels continued their advance beneath the rivers. The granite walls rose above the Manhattan streets. And when Penn Station finally opened in 1910, a bronze statue of Alexander Cassatt was placed in the Grand Arcade, the builder frozen forever in metal, gazing out at the crowds he would never live to see. Chapter 7. A Temple for Travelers. The station that Cassatt built was unlike anything America had ever witnessed. Step through the entrance on 7th Avenue, and you entered a world designed to overwhelm the senses and elevate the spirit. The exterior facade stretched for 2 full city blocks, lined with 84 massive Doric columns carved from pink granite quarried in Milford, Massachusetts. The columns were unfluted in the classical Greek style, their proportions calculated according to principles that architects had refined since the age of Pericles. The design drew inspiration from the Acropolis of Athens, from the colonnade of St. Peter's Square in Vatican City, from the Bank of England in London. It was a building that announced its importance before you ever stepped inside, a building that declared, "This is a place that matters. This is a gateway to somewhere significant. This is architecture worthy of a great civilization." But the exterior was merely the overture. The true magnificence lay within. Pass through the entrance hall, and you found yourself in the general waiting room, a space so vast it beggared the imagination. 300 feet long, 110 feet wide, 150 feet from the polished travertine floor to the peak of the coffered ceiling overhead. The nave of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the largest church in Christendom, was smaller than this room. Light poured through 8 enormous semicircular windows set high in the walls, each window tall enough to admit a 4-story building. The light fell on Corinthian columns that had taken sculptors a year to carve, on walls clad in creamy Italian travertine, on painted maps of the Pennsylvania railroad's vast domain stretching from New York to Chicago and beyond. The ceiling was a masterwork of engineering and artistry, coffered groin vaults that seemed to float impossibly overhead, each coffer deeply recessed to catch the light and shadow that moved across the room as the sun traced its arc outside. You could stand in that waiting room and feel the weight of history pressing down on you. The accumulated grandeur of 2,000 years of Western civilization distilled into a single American space. The main concourse offered a different kind of wonder. Here, iron and glass replaced stone and marble. A vast greenhouse roof of steel lattice and glass panels covered the space where passengers descended to the platforms below. Sunlight streamed through the glass ceiling and fell on the crowds below, on businessmen checking pocket watches, and soldiers shipping out to unknown destinations, and immigrants arriving in the New World with everything they owned in a single battered suitcase. The concourse was modern, where the waiting room was ancient, industrial, where the waiting room was imperial, but both spaces shared the same fundamental purpose. They existed to make passengers feel that they had arrived somewhere worthy of the journey that brought them there. But the real marvel of Penn Station was what visitors never saw. Beneath the marble floors and soaring ceilings lay a labyrinth of hidden infrastructure that made the visible grandeur possible. 21 tracks spread across 11 platforms accommodated the hundreds of trains that arrived and departed each day. 25 elevators moved passengers and baggage between levels. Miles of underground corridors connected the station to the post office next door, to nearby hotels, to the subway lines that fed passengers in from every corner of the city. A complex system of gravity chutes and conveyor belts transferred mail between the station and post office without ever requiring a truck to navigate the crowded streets above. Instant messages flew through the walls in a network of pneumatic tubes, or on small cylinders whooshing through pipes at 35 miles per hour, carrying information from ticket counters to baggage rooms to administrative offices. And outside the city entirely, in the rail yards of Sunnyside in Queens, acres of tracks and switching equipment and maintenance facilities formed the beating heart of the operation, the hidden machinery that kept the visible spectacle running on time. Chapter 8, The Crossroads of America Penn Station became the Crossroads of America. The number of passengers passing through its doors rose steadily from 10 million in 1911 to an almost incomprehensible 109 million in 1945, representing 65% of all intercity travel in the nation. Everyone passed through Penn Station: presidents and paupers, celebrities and anonymous commuters, and soldiers shipping overseas to fight in 2 world wars, kissing their sweethearts goodbye beneath the great clock in the concourse, not knowing if they would ever return. Immigrants arriving from Ellis Island, blinking in the cathedral light of the waiting room, taking their first steps into the American dream. Hollywood discovered the station and fell in love with its visual drama. The 1945 film The Clock featured scenes filmed in the actual station. Alfred Hitchcock's 1951 thriller Strangers on a Train staged a chase sequence through its corridors. Stanley Kubrick's 1955 noir Killer's Kiss opened and closed with shots of the Great Glass Concourse. Penn Station was not merely a building. It was a character, a symbol, a place that existed in the American imagination as surely as the Statue of Liberty or the Empire State Building. It was built to last forever. The station survived the Great Depression. Bread lines stretched through Manhattan streets, banks collapsed, fortunes evaporated overnight, and still Penn Station endured, its waiting room filled with travelers who had less money but no less need to move from one place to another. The station survived 2 world wars. Soldiers poured through its concourse by the millions, young men in uniform kissing wives and mothers goodbye beneath the great glass ceiling, heading off to fight in Europe and the Pacific, many of them never to return. In 1945, passenger traffic reached its absolute peak. 100 million people passed through Penn Station that single year. Did a river of humanity flowing through the marble halls at a rate of nearly 300,000 per day. The station had been built to handle crowds, and it handled them magnificently, absorbing the chaos of wartime travel without losing its essential dignity. It seemed indestructible. It seemed eternal. It was neither. Chapter 9. The Slow Death of a Monument. The first warning signs appeared almost immediately after the war ended. In 1947, the Pennsylvania Railroad recorded its first ever annual operating loss. The red ink was not catastrophic, not yet, but it was unprecedented for a company that had been printing money for nearly a century. The cause was not mysterious. Americans were falling in love with new ways of travel. The automobile, once a luxury for the wealthy, had become affordable to the middle class. Returning soldiers used their GI Bill benefits to buy houses in the suburbs, houses that required cars to reach, cars that required highways to drive on. The federal government was happy to oblige. The interstate highway system, authorized in 1956, would eventually pour billions of dollars into roads that made driving faster, easier, and cheaper than ever before. Why take a train from Philadelphia to New York when you could drive your own car on your own schedule and park it at your destination? And then came the jets. Commercial aviation had existed before the war, but it was expensive, uncomfortable, and limited in range. The post-war years changed everything. Jet engines made planes faster and more efficient. Competition drove down prices. By the late 1950s, you could fly from New York to Chicago in 2 hours for a fare that middle-class families could afford. The same trip by train took 16 hours. The mathematics were brutal, and they only got worse as the years passed. Passenger traffic at Penn Station began to fall. 10%, 20%, 30%. The crowds that had once filled the waiting room thinned to a trickle. The Great Hall, designed for multitudes, now echoed with emptiness. The Pennsylvania Railroad responded to declining revenues the way struggling companies always respond. They cut costs. Maintenance budgets were slashed. The pink granite exterior that had once gleamed in the Manhattan sunlight grew grimy with soot and neglect. Inside the station, renovations that would have horrified Charles McKim covered some of the grand Corinthian columns with plastic panels. A new ticket office was constructed in the middle of the central hallway, blocking sightlines that had been carefully calculated to inspire awe. The railroad was cannibalizing its own monument, stripping away the beauty that made it special in a desperate attempt to squeeze a few more dollars from the dying corpse of passenger rail. The station that had been built to make travelers feel like gods now made them feel like cattle being processed through a dingy holding pen. In 1955, behind closed doors, executives of the Pennsylvania Railroad made a decision that would seal Penn Station's fate. They agreed to sell the air rights above the station. Air rights are exactly what they sound like: the legal right to build in the empty space above a piece of property. Penn Station occupied some of the most valuable real estate in Manhattan, 4 full city blocks between 7th and 8th Avenues. The station itself was only a few stories tall. Above it stretched hundreds of feet of empty air that could be filled with office towers or apartment buildings or sports arenas, air that was worth a fortune to developers, even as the railroad beneath it bled money. The railroad kept the deal secret for years. Then in 1960, the Madison Square Garden Corporation formed with a real estate developer named Irving Mitchell Felt as its president. Felt had a vision. He would build a new Madison Square Garden, a modern sports and entertainment complex, directly on top of Pennsylvania Station. The old station would be demolished. A new underground station would be built beneath the arena, smaller and purely functional, stripped of all the ornament and grandeur that had made the original famous. In exchange for the air rights, the Pennsylvania Railroad would receive this new underground station at no cost to itself, plus a 25% ownership stake in the Madison Square Garden complex. On July 25, 1961, the front page of the New York Times carried a headline that sent shockwaves through the architectural world: New Madison Square Garden to rise atop Penn Station. The reaction was immediate and anguished. Architects who had spent their careers designing sleek modernist buildings stripped of historical ornament suddenly found themselves rushing to defend a Beaux-Arts monument that represented everything they had rejected. And the station was Roman. It was classical. It was the opposite of the glass and steel minimalism that dominated mid-century architecture. And yet architects understood what would be lost if it was destroyed. They understood that Penn Station was not merely old, but great, not merely historical, but irreplaceable. A building like this could never be built again. The skills were lost, the budgets impossible, the civic will vanished. To tear it down was not renovation or progress. It was amputation. In the summer of 1962, a group of young architects formed an organization with a deliberately provocative name, They called themselves the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York, shortened to AGBANY, and they set out to do something that had never been successfully done in New York City. They would try to save a building from the wrecking ball through public protest. On August 21, 1962, from 5 to 7 in the evening, they gathered on the sidewalk in front of Penn Station carrying hand-lettered signs. "Shame," one sign read. "Do not amputate, renovate. Read another." Photographers captured the scene. Young men in suits and ties, young women in summer dresses, walking in circles on the hot pavement, trying to shame a city into saving a masterpiece. Famous faces joined the protest. Philip Johnson, one of the most celebrated architects in America, a man who had championed the glass box modernism that Penn Station represented the antithesis of, marched with the picketers. Jane Jacobs was there too, the writer and activist whose book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, had become a Bible for urban preservationists. Jacobs would later recall the atmosphere of the protest with characteristic bluntness. "There was no exhilaration to this kind of thing," she said. "It was more like a wake. The city was making everyone's life absurd with its goofy decisions. The protesters knew, even as they marched, that they had already lost. The demolition contracts were signed. The financing was in place. The political deals had been cut. They were not fighting to save Penn Station. They were bearing witness to its murder." The architectural critic Ada Louise Huxtable wrote the epitaph in the pages of the New York Times in 1963. "The tragedy is that our own times not only could not produce such a building," she observed, "but cannot even maintain it." The sentence captured something essential about what was happening, not just to Penn Station, but to American culture itself. The country that had built the Transcontinental Railroad, that had constructed the Brooklyn Bridge, that had raised the Empire State Building in barely a year, was now announcing that it could no longer afford to maintain a train station. The problem was not really money. The problem was will. The problem was a civilization that had stopped believing that beauty and permanence mattered, that had decided efficiency and profit were the only values worth preserving, that looked at a Roman temple and saw only the dollar value of the air above it. Chapter 10. The Wrecking Ball Swings, October 28, 1963. A light rain falls on 7th Avenue. The sky is gray and low, the kind of sky that seems to press down on the city like a lid. Outside Penn Station, a small group of protesters stands in silence. They wear black armbands on their sleeves, the traditional symbol of mourning. They carry no signs today. They chant no slogans. There is nothing left to say. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the electric jackhammers begin to scream. The demolition of Penn Station would take 3 years. It could not be done quickly because the station had to keep functioning even as it was destroyed. Trains still needed to arrive and depart. Passengers still needed to reach their platforms. So the Pennsylvania Railroad and its contractors devised a grotesque solution. They would demolish the station from the top down while maintaining service below. A giant steel deck was placed over the tracks and platforms, creating a temporary ceiling beneath which the railroad could continue operations. Above this deck, the wrecking crews went to work, tearing apart the building piece by piece while commuters waited for trains in the shrinking space below. Photographs from those years capture something almost unbearable to look at. Passengers in business suits stand on platforms reading newspapers while construction debris rains down around them. Daylight streams through holes in the ceiling where holes were never meant to be. The great Corinthian columns of the waiting room, columns that had taken sculptors a year to carve, are wrapped in cables and pulled down one by one. Workers with cutting torches sliced through the steel framework of the glass concourse. The coffered ceiling that had floated 150 feet overhead, the ceiling modeled on the baths of Caracalla, is broken into chunks and loaded onto trucks. Each day the station grows smaller. Each day another piece of the dream disappears. And below it all, the trains keep running. The commuters keep commuting. Life goes on as if nothing of importance is being lost. The question of what to do with the remains proved surprisingly difficult to answer. Penn Station contained thousands of tons of pink granite, marble, travertine, and carved ornament. Much of it was still beautiful. Much of it was historically significant. Surely someone would want it. Surely some museum or park or civic institution would step forward to preserve at least the most important pieces. This did not happen. The granite columns that had lined the 7th Avenue facade, 84 of them, each weighing tons, and were loaded onto trucks and driven across the Hudson River to the swamps of Secaucus, New Jersey. There in the wetlands that would later become part of the Meadowlands Sports Complex, the columns were dumped like garbage. They sank into the mud, alongside broken concrete and twisted steel and all the other detritus of a demolished building. The pink granite that had been quarried in Massachusetts and shipped to Manhattan and carved by master craftsmen and assembled into a monument meant to last for centuries ended its existence in a New Jersey swamp. Not everything was lost. A New York Times photographer named Eddie Hausner ventured into the Meadowlands during the demolition and captured an image that would become iconic in preservation circles. It showed a massive stone sculpture lying on its side in the mud, surrounded by weeds and debris. The sculpture was called Day, one of a pair created by the German-born artist Adolf Alexander Weinmann that had adorned the station facade. Weinmann had been hired by McKim, Mead & White to create sculptural decorations for the building, and he had produced works of genuine artistry, allegorical figures representing day and night that had gazed down on 7th Avenue for half a century. Now, Day lay in a landfill, its classical features staring up at the gray New Jersey sky. The photograph was published, and it caused a minor scandal. Robert Rowe, the New Jersey Commissioner of Conservation and Economic Development, saw the image and was moved to action. He ordered that some of the station sculptures be salvaged from the dump and preserved. For the 22 stone eagles that had perched on the station facade became objects of particular fascination. Weinmann had designed them as symbols of American power and Pennsylvania Railroad pride, massive carved birds with wingspans of several feet. When the station was demolished, the eagles were scattered. Some were rescued and installed in new locations. At least 18 complete eagles survive today, spread across the country in parks and plazas and private collections. One stands at the entrance to Cooper Union in Manhattan. Several guard the approaches to the Market Street Bridge in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Others ended up in places as far-flung as Kansas City and Washington, D.C. They are refugees from a lost world, fragments of a civilization that destroyed itself. The remaining columns fared worse. 18 of the 84 Doric columns were supposed to be relocated to Battery Park at the southern tip of Manhattan, where they would have formed a memorial to the lost station. The plan was announced with some fanfare. It never happened. The columns ended up in the New Jersey landfill with everything else. They may still be there, buried beneath decades of accumulated fill, slowly sinking into the marsh. The Pennsylvania Railroad had destroyed its greatest monument in order to survive. The strategy failed spectacularly. The money from the Madison Square Garden deal was not enough to offset the fundamental collapse of the passenger rail business. The railroad continued to bleed cash. It merged with its ancient rival, the New York Central, in 1968, forming a new company called Penn Central. The merger was supposed to create efficiencies and economies of scale. Instead, it created chaos. The two railroads had incompatible equipment, incompatible labor agreements, incompatible corporate cultures. Penn Central lost money at a staggering rate, over $1 million per day by some estimates. On June 21, 1970, 2.5 years after the merger and just 4 years after the demolition of Penn Station was completed, Penn Central declared bankruptcy. It was the largest corporate failure in American history to that point. The company that had once called itself the Standard Railroad of the world, the company that had employed 200,000 workers and moved more freight than any other railroad on earth, the company that had torn down a Roman temple because it could not afford to maintain it, was now a ward of the bankruptcy courts. Penn Station was gone. The Pennsylvania Railroad was gone, and Madison Square Garden sat atop the ruins like a monument to corporate miscalculation. What rose in place of Penn Station was precisely as uninspiring as the preservationists had predicted. The new Madison Square Garden complex opened in 1968. It consisted of 3 main elements. The garden itself was a squat cylindrical structure, a concrete drum that squatted over the train platforms like a flying saucer that had crash-landed in Midtown Manhattan. Next to it rose 2 Penn Plaza, a generic glass and steel office tower indistinguishable from dozens of others that had sprouted across the city during the post-war building boom. And below them both, in the basement where trains still arrived and departed, lay the new Pennsylvania station. The new station was everything the old station was not. Where the original had soared, the replacement crouched. Where the original had flooded with natural light, the replacement huddled in fluorescent dimness. Where the original had offered vast open spaces designed to inspire awe, the replacement provided cramped corridors designed to move bodies efficiently from street to platform. The ceilings were low, the finishes were cheap, the signage was confusing, the ventilation was inadequate. 650,000 people pass through this space every weekday, making it the busiest transportation hub in the Western Hemisphere. They navigate a maze of underground passages that seem designed to disorient rather than guide. They wait for trains in spaces so cramped that rush-hour crowds press against each other in sweaty intimacy. They emerge onto the street through exits that could be mistaken for subway entrances or basement stairwells. Nothing about the experience announces that you have arrived somewhere important. Nothing suggests that you have reached the gateway to the greatest city in America. The architectural historian Vincent Scully wrote the definitive epitaph for what had been lost. One entered the city like a god, he observed. One scuttles in now like a rat. The sentence has been quoted thousands of times in the decades since he wrote it, and it remains the most precise description of what the demolition of Penn Station meant. It was not simply that a beautiful building had been replaced by an ugly one. It was that an experience had been destroyed, a way of arriving in New York that made you feel the significance of where you were. The old Penn Station had told every passenger that they mattered, that their journey mattered, that the city they were entering was worthy of Roman grandeur. The new Penn Station tells passengers that they are units to be processed, that efficiency is the only value, that beauty is a luxury a modern city cannot afford. The controversy over the demolition and its deplored replacement did not end with the building. It became instead a catalyst for something larger, a turning point in how Americans thought about their architectural heritage and whether it deserved to be saved. Penn Station died so that other buildings might live. This is the bitter consolation that preservationists offer when they tell the story of its destruction. The demolition was so shocking, so unnecessary, so obviously a mistake even as it was happening, that it forced New York City to create the legal machinery that would prevent such tragedies from recurring. On April 15, 1965, less than 2 years after the jackhammers began their work on 7th Avenue, Mayor Robert Wagner signed the Landmarks Preservation Law. For the first time in the city's history, there was now a government agency with the power to designate buildings as landmarks and to prevent their owners from demolishing them. The Landmarks Preservation Commission could look at a building and declare it worthy of protection, regardless of what the owner wanted to do with the property. It was a revolutionary change in how American cities thought about the relationship between private property and public heritage. The New York law inspired imitators across the country. A year after Wagner signed the Landmarks Preservation Law, Congress passed the National Historic Preservation Act, creating a federal framework for identifying and protecting historically significant buildings nationwide. Other cities rushed to establish their own preservation commissions and landmark laws. The destruction of Penn Station had demonstrated with terrible clarity what could happen when a city had no legal mechanism to save its treasures. No other city wanted to learn that lesson firsthand. The death of one monument sparked a movement that would save thousands of others. The most dramatic test of the new preservation laws came just 3 years after Penn Station fell. Grand Central Terminal, the magnificent Beaux-Arts station that the New York Central Railroad had built to compete with Penn Station, faced its own demolition threat. The railroad wanted to build a skyscraper on top of it, a plan that would have required destroying the terminal's iconic facade and grand concourse. The Landmarks Preservation Commission designated Grand Central as a landmark in 1967, blocking the development. The railroad sued, arguing that the designation amounted to an unconstitutional taking of its property without compensation. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled in 1978 that the Landmarks Law was constitutional. Grand Central was saved. The building that might have followed Penn Station into oblivion instead became a symbol of what preservation could accomplish. Today, millions of visitors pass through its restored concourse each year, looking up at the famous ceiling painted with constellations, experiencing exactly the kind of arrival that Penn Station passengers will never know again. The memory of Penn Station refused to fade. In the early 1990s, United States Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan began promoting a plan that seemed almost quixotic. He wanted to build a new Pennsylvania station, a structure that would restore some of the grandeur that had been lost. Moynihan had a personal connection to the original station. During the Great Depression, as a boy growing up in poverty in Hell's Kitchen, he had shined shoes in Penn Station's waiting room. He remembered what it felt like to stand in that vast space, to look up at those soaring ceilings, to feel small and awed, and somehow elevated all at once. He never forgot that feeling, and he never forgave the city for destroying the place that had given it to him. Moynihan's plan centered on the James A. Farley Post Office, the massive neoclassical building that stood directly across 8th Avenue from the old Penn Station site. The post office had been designed by McKim, Mead & White as a companion to the station, and its Corinthian colonnade echoed the grandeur of the demolished building. Moynihan proposed converting part of the post office into a new train hall that would serve Amtrak and Long Island Railroad passengers. The project moved slowly through decades of planning and funding battles. Moynihan himself died in 2003 without seeing his vision realized, but the project continued under his name. Moynihan Train Hall finally opened in January 2021, nearly 30 years after the senator first proposed it. The new hall features a skylight that floods the space with natural light, soaring ceilings, and the kind of architectural ambition that had been absent from the Penn Station experience for more than half a century. It is not the original, nothing could be, but it is an acknowledgement that the original mattered, that its loss was a wound worth trying to heal. The fragments of Penn Station scattered across the landscape like relics of a martyred saint. The Eagles proved particularly peripatetic. 4 of them traveled to Philadelphia, where they now perch on the Market Street Bridge spanning the Schuylkill River. The Fairmount Park Art Association acquired them and installed them 4 years after the demolition, stone guardians watching over a river far from the avenue they were carved to protect. Another eagle found an unlikely home in the Long Island suburbs. Samuel Goldberg, a Latin teacher at Hicksville High School, learned that the eagles were being discarded and organized his students to save one. They raised money, arranged transportation, and installed the eagle at the Hicksville station of the Long Island Railroad. A plaque below it bears an inscription in Latin that translates roughly as a Roman eagle, once urban, is now in Hicksville, quite suburban. The joke contains a truth. These eagles were designed for a temple. They ended up decorating suburban train platforms and highway bridges. Nobility in exile. The Brooklyn Museum preserves 2 substantial remnants of the original station in its Steinberg family sculpture garden. One is the sculpture called Night, the companion piece to the day that Eddie Hausner photographed lying in the New Jersey mud. Night stands 11 feet tall, a classical female figure representing the hours of darkness, carved by Adolf Weinman to adorn a building that no longer exists. Nearby stands a partial marble column from the waiting hall, a fragment of one of those massive Corinthian columns that rose 150 feet to support the coffered ceiling. The column is broken now, truncated, a piece of something that was once part of something vast. Visitors can touch it if they want. They can run their fingers over marble that was quarried in Italy and shipped across the ocean and carved by craftsmen and installed in a room designed to make human beings feel the weight of civilization. The column does not know that the room is gone. The marble does not know that it is an orphan. It simply endures, the way stone endures, waiting for someone to remember what it meant. Pennsylvania Station endures, but not in the way Alexander Cassatt imagined when he sacrificed his health and his life to will it into existence. It endures in the eagles perched on a bridge in Philadelphia, stone sentinels guarding a river they were never meant to see. It endures in a column fragment in a Brooklyn sculpture garden, where visitors can touch marble that once supported a ceiling modeled on the baths of Caracalla. It endures in a goddess called Night, 11 feet of carved allegory rescued from a New Jersey swamp, now standing in a museum courtyard instead of adorning a 7th Avenue facade. It endures in the low-ceilinged corridors beneath Madison Square Garden, where 650,000 people scuttle through every weekday, squinting at confusing signs and pressing against strangers in narrow passageways, never knowing what once stood above them, never imagining that their grandparents arrived in this same spot and looked up and gasped at 150 feet of coffered ceiling and Corinthian columns and light pouring through windows tall enough to admit a 4-story building. It endures in the law that saved Grand Central Terminal from the same fate. It endures in the landmarks commissions that now operate in cities across America, commissions that exist because New York City proved what happens when there is no legal mechanism to protect beauty from profit. It endures every time someone looks at a beautiful old building threatened with demolition and says, "We cannot let this happen again." It endures in Moynihan Train Hall, that belated attempt to restore some fragment of grandeur to the experience of arriving in New York by rail, a building that would never have been built if the original had survived, a monument to guilt as much as to transportation. But preservation through destruction is a bitter kind of immortality. The original Penn Station was designed to welcome travelers as gods. It was built by a man who believed that the ordinary act of arriving in a city could be transformed into something extraordinary, and something that elevated the spirit and announced that you had reached a place worthy of your journey. And for 53 years, it did exactly that. Soldiers shipping off to 2 world wars kissed their sweethearts goodbye beneath its soaring vaults, not knowing if they would ever return. Immigrants who had crossed oceans in steerage took their first steps into the American dream beneath arches modeled on Roman temples. 100 million people passed through its doors in 1945 alone, more than any other building in America, and every single one of them was invited to feel for a moment that they mattered, that their presence in this city was an event worthy of marble and granite and light. And then we tore it down, not because it was structurally unsound, not because it was dangerous, not because some disaster had damaged it beyond repair. We tore it down because the land beneath it was worth more than the beauty above it. We tore it down because a railroad was losing money and a developer saw profit in the air rights. We tore it down because a civilization that had built it could no longer be bothered to maintain it. Ada Louise Huxtable was right. The tragedy was not simply that we destroyed the building. The tragedy was that we had become a people incapable of creating such a building and incapable of valuing it enough to let it stand. There is a lesson here, though it is not a comfortable one. The lesson is that stone outlasts ambition, that buildings outlast their builders, that Alexander Cassatt poured his life into a monument he never lived to see completed, and that monument was destroyed by the very corporation he had led. The lesson is that beauty has no constituency, that grandeur cannot defend itself, that a masterpiece will be torn down the moment it becomes more profitable to replace it with something ordinary. The lesson is that we get the architecture we deserve, and we deserve the low ceilings and fluorescent lights and cramped corridors of the current Penn Station, because we chose them. We chose them when we let the wrecking ball swing. We chose them when we stood on the sidewalk in black armbands and watched and did nothing that mattered. We chose them, and we are still choosing them every day in 1,000 small decisions about what we value and what we discard. Vincent Scully said it best. Through Pennsylvania Station, one entered the city like a god. One scuttles in now like a rat. Perhaps that is exactly what we deserve. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Your support makes these deep dives into America's forgotten history possible. Tell me in the comments, what lost building do you wish you could have seen? What demolished treasure haunts your city? Should we try to rebuild Penn Station, or is that a fantasy? Should Madison Square Garden be moved to finally give New York a train station worthy of its name? Or is some destruction simply beyond repair, some wounds too deep to heal, some lessons too painful to learn more than once? I read every comment, and I want to know what you think. Next time, we will explore another monument America chose to forget, another story of beauty and ambition, and the choices that destroyed them. Another lesson in what we value and what we throw away. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.